host, Nick Jikomis, and today I'm speaking with Leighton Woodhouse. Leighton is a freelance journalist and documentary filmmaker, and he writes a Substack at leightonwoodhouse.substack.com. It's called Social Studies, and I'll link to it in the episode description. It's a Substack that I subscribe to, that I read quite often. Leighton's a really good writer. He writes about a variety of contemporary social issues, and he has a background in sociology, so he writes about various things that are going on in our society and analyzes, what's going on, why it's happening the way it's happening, and where things might go. He's really good at writing with clarity and putting things in historical context, bringing in a lot of ideas from sociological thinkers, past and present, and using some of those ideas to try and make sense of what's going on today. We talked about a variety of contemporary subjects. One of them was the homelessness and drug addiction epidemic that's been growing and spreading in America for some time. We discussed why that is an issue, where it's coming from, and why our governments at the local level can't seem to deal with it, why the problem gets worse despite so many resources being poured into solving it. We talked about things like nonprofit organizations, which are ostensibly there to solve these problems, but often end up perpetuating them, and we talked about why that is. We spent some time talking about ideology and religion, the role that religion plays in society, and how certain ideologies evolve, and how they allow people to rationalize their actions and get attached to certain ideas in order to justify why they act in a certain way. We talked about things like college education and how that has evolved over the years. We talked about the concept of elites in society, people that wield either economic power or cultural power, and what that actually means, and the concept of overproduction of elites, which is something I've discussed on the podcast before. The idea that there comes times in societies where you produce too many people who feel that they should be entitled to elite status, and when you overproduce those people, you produce more of them than there are actual slots to hold them, it can have a destabilizing effect on society. We talked about sociological thinkers like Emil Durkheim and some of the concepts that they've used to try and understand societal dynamics. We talked about things like the institution of science, how science is actually conducted in practice, what the incentives are driving what scientists do and why they do it, and how things like science and things like ideology and things like religious concepts are often co-opted and used by people in certain social strata to justify their place in society and try and steer the culture one way or the other. And a lot of our discussion really just centered on this notion that we may be in a state of civilizational decline, that in many ways the standard of living has been declining for many people for some time now, and we really just touched on that subject from a number of different angles and tried to figure out, well, what's going on there, where might things be going, and what's actually driving this state of anomie or state of decline that we discuss at various points throughout the discussion. So if you're interested in sociology and social psychology and what it is about human social psychology and how we interact with each other that gives rise to these larger patterns that we see in society, how certain institutions develop and how they behave, how certain policies get put into place, why we have laws, what function they actually play. If you're interested in those types of things, this is a really interesting discussion. Leighton's not a scientist, as most of my guests actually are. He's a writer and a journalist, and he's a background in sociology. Nonetheless, I really like the way that he writes about things, and I thought a lot of his ideas were really interesting, and they dovetail a lot with some of the things that I've been thinking about recently. As always, if you enjoy the content I'm producing on this podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. You can subscribe to the free weekly newsletter or become a paid supporter to support the podcast further at mindandmatter.substack.com. This episode is supported in part by the Amino Company. They specialize in making science-backed amino acid products that you can mix into any drink. Their products contain a mixture of essential amino acids, the building blocks of proteins in the body, as well as other nutrients including minerals like iron and electrolytes like potassium. Your body is constantly repairing damage, and your muscles and tissues need the right mix of amino acids and nutrients to do this effectively. One thing I like about Amino Co. is they actually conduct clinical trials to determine what their products really do. They have a variety of formulations engineered for different purposes, and my personal favorite is one called Heal, which has been shown to be 3 times more efficient at triggering muscle growth and repair than other protein sources. It helps maintain healthy inflammation levels and preserve muscle mass during periods of inactivity. I mix this product into the water bottle I bring to the gym and consume it before, during, and after my workouts, and I have felt a noticeable difference in my performance during those workouts and my recovery times from soreness and fatigue afterwards. Their products are keto-friendly, soy-free, vegetarian or vegan, gluten-free, and non-GMO, so they are compatible compatible with almost any diet or lifestyle. You can support the podcast and try Heal or any of their other products by using the discount code MIND when you visit aminoco.com/mind. You will get 30% off your purchase. If you work out regularly or do intensive exercise, I recommend trying AminoCo's products. I get a lot of companies reaching out to me about advertising, and I only end up using and liking a small percentage of the products that I see. So check out aminoco.com/mind and use the code MIND to try these products today for 30% off. And with that, here's my conversation with Leighton Woodhouse. I've read your stuff on Substack for some time now, and I really like your writing.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, you cover interesting topics. The writing's good. I mean, just irrespective of what you write about, I just love the way that you actually write.
Thank you very much.
I love how you talk about contemporary subjects, but you also sort of bring in and kind of revitalize a lot of old ideas that people probably haven't heard before. And I always appreciate that. And so where you said you're calling in from Oakland?
Yes, I live in Oakland.
And so how long have you been there?
Well, I grew up in the Bay Area. So this is home in terms of my childhood. I grew up in Berkeley. And I've lived here in Oakland for probably the past 5 years. Before that, I was in LA for quite some time. Brief stint in New York City. Went to college on the East Coast. I think that about covers it.
Okay, so you grew up in the Bay Area. You've been on the East Coast. You've also been in LA. You know, when it comes to the Bay Area and LA, and a lot of cities in America, but I think the West Coast cities in particular. I live in Seattle. I've spent a fair amount of time in Portland. I've been down to SF and LA several times over the last few years. What's going on? A lot of people are talking about these cities, SF and LA, maybe, sort of as the poster children of this phenomenon that's going on, where we see just this explosion in homelessness and drug addiction and stuff. Yeah. As someone who's been there for a number of years, how have you observed that change actually take place, and what do you think is going on there?
Well, first of all, I think you see it as well, because it's definitely in Seattle, this sort of civilizational breakdown. Having grown up in the Bay Area I've lived in California almost my entire life, but I've spent enough time on the East Coast to be able to draw a contrast. And, I've always felt like, of course, like New York City is now experiencing a little bit of a touch of what we have here. A lot more violence and just random crime and things like that. But my experience has been that the East Coast is somewhat of a more civilized place than the West Coast. And I mean that, I know that just sounds like a pejorative against the West Coast, but I mean something specific by that, which is like, I think that, and maybe, New York City is what I'm most familiar with on the East Coast, but there's something about living in such a dense area where being in public is such a big part of your day-to-day life that I think it builds. And, we're going to get into Durkheim, but this is very Durkheimian about kind of it builds the sense of social solidarity that we never have had on the West Coast. A lot of it because of our car culture, single family home living. But then also there's something political on the West Coast. There's this libertarian strain to the culture on the West Coast. I mean, here in the Bay Area, it's kind of where it was created, because a lot of this stuff, if you've read that book, the famous book from Counterculture to Cyberculture, he writes about this sort of the Back to the Land movement in the 60s, which, well, actually he goes back further than that with the military infrastructure in California, combined with this sort of what happened in the 60s of the Back to the Land movement, created this kind of like tech libertarian ethos, which then was fused with the West Coast's inherent kind of liberalness. So now we have this.
What was the name of that book?
What was his name? It's called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. Fred, I'm forgetting his name now. He's a Stanford professor, and it's about Stuart Brand, who's the guy who created the Whole Earth catalog, and his role in creating the cultural conditions that gave rise to the computer revolution and then Silicon Valley. So it's an interesting book. Anyway, so there's this sort of like the politics here are very left libertarian, which is a dangerous combination in my opinion, because it's sort of like there's both the kind of commitment to social justice, which is a good thing, but there's the sort of there's a reflexive, how do I describe this? There's like, it's sort of like the big nanny state kind of authoritarianism fused with this sort of like anything goes libertarianism, which creates a situation in which, like, for example, we have this idea that homeless people who are pitching tents on sidewalks, defecating in the street, who are enslaved to their addictions. It's not their fault. I mean, they may have made some mistakes that got them into this position in the first place, but once you're just full on psychotic and addicted, you're no longer obviously in control of yourself. And then this attitude prevails among progressives in the Bay Area, which is like, well, that's their right to live as they choose, and we shouldn't intervene. And any kind of application of a coercion is somehow immoral, even though the alternative is allowing people to live in utter misery while destroying the social fabric of our cities. And I think that's very much the same in I think Seattle has a lot of that too.
Yeah, there's some interesting psychology there, I think. As someone who's a big fan of choice among, psychologically sovereign adults, in almost any domain of life, what is the word choice mean in the context of someone who is literally psychotic and literally addicted to fentanyl or methamphetamine or what have you?
Right. There is no choice. I mean, I've had this argument so many times that, like, addiction is not a choice. It is a lack of choice. And if you do not intervene, I mean, it sort of like reminds me of the cliche thought experiment with the tracks, with the split track with the train coming down it, and one person's tied up on the tracks on one side, one track, and 10 people on the other. But you actually have to hit the lever to be able to switch to the one that kills the one person. It's like we are not touching the lever and headed towards the 10 people that the train is about to barrel over. And we're like, well, we're moral people. This is the ethical choice. It's like, it's not the ethical choice. You're allowing people to die by refusing to intervene. And I'm not going to pretend that there isn't a lot of moral complexity around the decision to intervene and essentially use coercive means to help people. That is a morally complicated situation as well. But let's not pretend that refusing to do that is not also morally fraught.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and sort of the general issue of, I guess, social decay, as it manifests in more homelessness, more drug addiction, more psychosis, more suffering among that population. It seems to be happening very steadily and linearly, in my view. So I've been on the West Coast for 6 years now, and I moved to Seattle. And I live in a neighborhood which, when I moved here, it was described as having character, that's up and coming, and that will be getting better. And that's not what happened. And what's kind of, in my view, what
neighborhood is it?
I live in Pioneer Square, which, loosely speaking, you might be able to say that that's the analog of what's the big one in SF where
the Tenderloin?
The Tenderloin, yeah. It's not that bad. But what I was about to say is, when I visited, I've been in Seattle, I've visited Portland, LA, and SF multiple times over the past 2 years, multiple times each. And my personal experience is almost like Portland today is like what Seattle's going to look like in 1 or 2 years. Seattle or Portland is maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years behind SF. And it's almost like you can see everything being pulled towards, what the Tenderloin in SF has become. And it's spreading, it's getting worse, not better. And what's remarkable about that is, when you look at the stats and stuff, and I know that you've written about this, SF, as one example, they spend something like $1 billion or more a year on homelessness. So what the hell is going on? Like, if that amount of resources being allocated, why isn't any improvement seem to be happening?
Right. And I've written about this as well because I mean there is a relationship and it's an inverse relationship. The more we spend, the worse the problem gets. And I think that that's something that we need to be paying attention to. And I have a theory as to why it's happening, and which is about the fact that there's an industry that has evolved around the homelessness problem in San Francisco, and around the addiction crisis in San Francisco. And like any industry, no matter how many good people you populate it with, no matter how well intentioned these organizations are, the organizations start to take on their own institutional interests, which are kind of discrete from the populations that they purport to serve. And on the most basic level, they have an organizational interest in making sure that their funding is renewed. I want to be clear that, I don't want to be unrealistically cynical. It's not like the leaders of these organizations wake up in the morning and decide and try to plot how they can maximize their budget for the following year. It's just an ever-present imperative that they have their budgets renewed because they have employees, they have a payroll to meet, they have rent to pay. And so, if you ever worked in the nonprofit industry, you're aware of how much that dominates your day-to-day life. If you're working like a bootstrap nonprofit, you're constantly worried about your next year's budget.
Yeah, not in terms of, as you said, it's not like you're cynically trying to get the biggest budget possible necessarily. It's that you have employees and they have families and you have to make a payroll. And I like that you use the word evolved. These institutional structures evolve organically based on incentives. They're not engineered by someone, trying to make them this way.
Right, exactly. It's a very natural phenomenon. It's as natural as yeast emerging from flour and water. And so you have these organizations, they have incentives, and I think that what ends up happening, and this would be an interesting thing to pay close attention to exactly how it happens, which I have not done, but there's an ideological formation that happens when you have these immediate concrete incentives, but then you also have political and moral convictions. And there's a tension between those two. For example, you might start off thinking, well, we want to house all the homeless and get rid of the homelessness problem, which one would assume most people who go into these organizations have that value or that mission.
Yeah.
But there's a tension between that mission and the longevity of your organization, since if you solve the homeless problem, you have no more business model, is a crass way of putting it. And so I think eventually over time, this is a very kind of, I think, subtle and gradual process. And I think it's kind of comparable. The way that it happens is like natural selection. It's like, just out of the confluence of ideas, sort of these certain ideas which have an elective affinity with your material interests start to emerge and sort of be naturally selected away from the others. And eventually you come up with an ideology which is very conveniently serves your organization's interest, which is, in the case of San Francisco, people should be allowed to camp on the streets. People should be allowed to do as many drugs as they want to. Sure, if you want to get clean, then you should have that option, but there should be no pressure to push you towards recovery. We should just hand out foil, hand out pipes, hand out needles, create zones for you to be able to use your drugs, and then we can serve that, we can staff that, or you can give a chunk of the city budget goes to us to staff and provide those services. And so, it's a convenient it's a convenient fusion between your ideology, your quote unquote radical ideology, and your frankly neoliberal material goals.
Yeah. It would seem to be that the evolutionary dynamic here is that you get this nice complementarity between the material interests of the institution wanting to perpetuate itself and sort of the ideology forming around that, such that those interests are served while at the same time the people engaging in the behavior within the institution believe they're doing the right thing and are sort of blinded to the fact that they're not actually doing what they think they're doing, which is decreasing the amount of suffering among these populations.
Exactly. And we should be clear that these organizations, these organizations, these nonprofits are, I've written about this before as well, they are it's a neoliberal business model, and I mean that in the sense that, like, at one point in time, it was the government's responsibility to to take on these tasks. But now, in city after city, we've gotten just over the, like, the last 30 or 40 years, we've gotten used to these ideas of, like, these public-private partnerships and sort of outsourcing these municipal responsibilities to private nonprofits, which have no transparency requirements, et cetera. And so, we've it's been adopted in many very progressive cities where it's like, we're, instead of having city workers do this stuff, we're going to have this constellation of shoestring nonprofits do it. And that is privatization. It's just that it's not seen as privatization in these progressive areas because you're talking about a nonprofit, it's 501c3, and these are like do-gooders who sign up for it. And these are political radicals also who tend to staff it. They're like, they're like anarchists and they have pink hair or whatever. So, like, clearly this isn't privatization. But come on, it's privatization. And so, like, the business model is a neoliberal one, which is essentially like shifting responsibility from the public sector to the private sector to administer, to take care, to manage these populations. But the political ideology is, like, aesthetically radical.
Yeah, I see. And so does it simply not occur to people to sit down and say things like, all right, we've been doing things this way for X number of years. Let's just look at the data. How many of the homeless people that are being served in this way are choosing to get off drugs and seek that kind of treatment, and how many aren't? Because the answer would seem to be basically 0% of them.
Yeah.
Is no one noticing this, or is it being ignored, or?
I think the ideology takes care of that. I mean, like, you have, like, first of all, I think when the sort of the leaders of this nonprofit industry take a walk through the Tenderloin or through Pioneer Square, or do you guys have an area called the Blade? Is that like some Skid Row in Seattle?
Not that I've heard of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe that was some time ago. I think they walk through these areas and they say to themselves, "Oh, the shame and horrors of capitalism." They're like, this is the human wreckage of our white supremacist fascist state and our evil capitalist system. I think that's as far as the ideology goes. And then it's like, well, and then there's this white savior complex. I mean, not all these people are white, and there's no point in bringing race into this, but as a shorthand, there is sort of this, like, the equivalent of, maybe it's a class-based savior complex, but there's this sort of like, oh, I will be a steward to these people and take care of these casualties of capitalism and respect them and give them dignity. And what respecting and giving them dignity means is to allow them to continue to live in absolute misery, because that's supposed to be their autonomous choice. Like, a lot of these people who I've argued with, I believe, think that the choice that living on the street in a sidewalk doing meth all day is a
sovereign choice that's being made.
is like a decision that people have made, rather than a hole you've fallen in and cannot get out of.
Right.
And so, like, their dignity is somehow respecting their dignity to not change this situation for them. So I think the ideology is very malleable and has no problem accommodating those concerns.
Yeah. And so what about, like, so when we think about the drug addiction component of this in particular, right, there are many different views that many different people have on here. Everyone's got a different view on sort of the spectrum of legal versus illegal versus decriminalized, how we should be criminalizing certain types of drug use or not, and what that should look like in any society. You've got the SF model, we'll just call it, the way that things are being handled in SF today. Mm-hmm. You've got let's compare and contrast that with a way that another society does it. I think an interesting one there is Portugal, right, where they've done a lot of decriminalization. And my understanding is that many people have a confused view on how that model is actually implemented and governed in Portugal. Yes. So can you talk about that a little bit and kind of contrast it to what we're doing here on the West Coast?
Yeah, and I've never been to Portugal, but Michael Schellenberger has written quite a bit about it, and Michael and I are, kind of friends and collaborators. And my understanding from Michael and from other people I've spoken to who have been to Portugal is that none of the stuff that you see in San Francisco is happening in Lisbon. People are not smoking meth on the street or pitching sidewalks on the street. And if you do, there's law enforcement. They enforce laws there. But an arrest does not mean incarceration. This is something that people need to like understand about the criminal justice system, is that arresting somebody is just stopping them from doing what they're doing and detaining them for a period of time. And then you have various pathways you can go down, only one of which is incarceration. But, you know, they have the infrastructure to force people and the laws to force people into recovery. And that's what I think that we should be doing here. So it's not, they haven't done this like free for all, abolish the police type attitude where they're just like, we'll just let it happen. And then we'll just, you know, make sure that people don't overdose and we'll administer them Narcan if they do. That's not what's happening in Portugal.
Yeah. My understanding in Portugal is they've decriminalized drugs. So it's okay to have them, but you can't sell them. You can't use them openly in public. And those things are policed. Like right. you will be penalized. You won't be sent to prison for life, but you will be fined or something if you engage in those activities.
Right. Right.
But they have a decriminalization framework. So it's not that decriminalization in Portugal does not mean you can just walk around smoking meth and shooting heroin wherever you want, whenever you want, however you want.
No, quite the opposite. It's a more civilized society than what we have here in California. And, you know, the people who most defend the right of people to smoke meth on a sidewalk, you know, they think of themselves as compassionate because they're, in their minds, they are sort of defending the dignity and autonomy of the least among us. But like the Tenderloin is a working class neighborhood. It has been for 100 years has been a working class neighborhood. It used to be where the maritime workers went, and a lot of the SROs are left over from these cheap hotels that maritime workers would rent out when they were on leave on shore. And then it became sort of it's always been this very working class neighborhood, but like really a lower class neighborhood, like the most marginal of the working class. And today it continues to be like there are it's not Skid Row in LA. Skid Row is mostly, commercial warehouse based area. There are retail stores, but it's a lot of there's the flower district and the fashion district where it's a lot of big wholesale places. So there's not a lot of population density in terms of certainly in terms of residents. I don't think many people, I don't know the number, but outside of homeless people, it's not like there's big condos in Skid Row. The Tenderloin is a densely populated area with tons and tons of immigrant families. A lot of Yemeni families is the most recent sort of influx. So there's a lot of people who fled the war in Yemen, and the only place that they could afford is the Tenderloin. Yemeni families tend to come from fairly culturally conservative Muslim families. So you can imagine the culture shock when they have to walk their kids onto the streets and seeing what they're seeing. They have these. They used to have a thing called the Yellow Brick Road, which I think they're bringing back. Which is they had in the Tenderloin, they had from certain residential, I believe, apartment buildings to schools, they would have pathways that were marked in yellow, and that was the Yellow Brick Road for kids to be able to get to school. And during the hours of kids going to and from school, the police would ask the drug dealers and the drug users to vacate that area for an hour. And the drug dealers abided by it because it's, why not? It's not a big deal for them, and it's better than having to complicate things with the police. But it's they set up these yellow brick roads so that kids wouldn't have to be exposed to walking through an open air drug market. They don't have that anymore, but what they do have is a bunch of volunteer parents who come out and basically create a human corridor to walk kids to school. So it's where's your compassion for these poor immigrant families who have to live in this shit? They can't go to the playground because the playground is filled with tents and users, and there's drug dealers right across the street openly dealing meth. It's there's more kids in the Tenderloin per capita than any other neighborhood in San Francisco. It's those are the people who are suffering from it, not me. I live in Oakland across the bay. I don't have to see that outside my front door every day.
And so, when you think about the people who live in these neighborhoods, the people you were just talking about, other people, and they're living amongst amongst this and adjacent to it, and they see it day after day. Not only are they seeing the drug use and the homelessness, but they're seeing various crimes, including sometimes even violent crimes, not being dealt with and not being punished and not being deterred. What does that kind of experience day after day for months or years start to do to what we might just call the general social fabric of the neighborhood, the sense of culture and community? And how does that start to tie into what Durkheim and others would say is the purpose of laws?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I think that there was a story of, I believe it was a Yemeni family. It was a Muslim family, immigrant family from the Middle East, and there's a 10-year-old girl who was assaulted in the middle of a intersection by a woman who was like psychotically, she had a drug-induced psychosis, and she attacked. It was a hate crime because I think she said something about her hijab. 10-year-old girl hit her in the head, and that girl, this is the Chronicle reported on it. That girl, she saw her assailant like a few months later, just on the street. So this girl's already been traumatized by this crazy woman who just hit her in the head, and then she's just walking around. She's seeing her. She was just freed again, after assaulting a child. So you can imagine just on a personal level what the fear and trauma would be for that child.
Yeah.
This child who, if I'm right that she was Yemeni, then she was just, her family had escaped a war to get into this context. By the way, there's another related story, and I will come back to your question, but there was another family, a Yemeni family in the East Bay in Oakland, who fled the war. They set up a liquor store in Oakland, and there was a complicated, I won't go into the details, but somebody got shot in their liquor store, and then the assailants, or in retaliation, the people who retaliated thought that the owners of the store were mixed up with the person who shot them. So they burned down the house of the owner of the store, and the father in the family and his 2-year-old daughter were burned alive in the fire. They'd escaped Yemen to come to America to escape violence, and this is what happened to them. So anyway, to get back to your question, vis-a-vis Durkheim, I believe that retribution serves an important purpose in criminal justice. It's not the only purpose, but a lot of people on the left outright dismiss retribution as serving any purpose whatsoever, right? They're like, maybe you can make a case for incapacitation. Maybe you can make a case for deterrence. Definitely we should be doing rehabilitation, but we're not doing that in the criminal justice system.
Before you go further, can you just sort of unpack those at a very basic level? You got deterrence, you got incapacitation, you've got retribution as possible reasons to legally punish someone. What are each of those things, and what's sort of the common sense thinking that most people might have about each one?
Right. So we have rehabilitation, which we clearly don't do. And, that's fix you so you don't so when you get out, you can become an upstanding citizen instead of a career criminal. Incapacitation is just basically like keep you off the streets, right? If you're a repeat offender and you're just going out every weekend dealing drugs or murdering people, you should be held in a place behind lock and key where you have no access to the streets, because then fewer people get hurt. By the way, that's mass incarceration, and a lot of people have a knee-jerk reflex against it, as do I. I don't believe that mass incarceration is a good thing, but we should acknowledge that that one factor in the dip in the crime rate, that happened between the over the last 20 years and still started spiking up again, was a result of the war on drugs, which everybody for good reason, frowns upon. But we incapacitated a lot of criminals, and when they served their terms and were released back onto the streets, they were repeat offenders, and we saw the crime rate go up again. That's not the only factor, but it is a factor, is that one of the reasons why the crime rate plummeted is because we had so many people who would have otherwise been committing crimes in prison. So again, that doesn't justify the war on drugs or mass incarceration. It's just a reality that we have to live with and kind of accommodate. But anyway, so that's incapacitation. Deterrence is, if I do this, then I'm going to get in trouble, so I'm not going to do it, right? If there's a deterrence, doesn't work in America either, because the clearance rate of these police departments is so low that you're going to get away with a crime. Like the chances are, in order for deterrence to work, you have to be reasonably confident that you're going to get caught. But that's deterrence. And then retribution is revenge. It's social revenge, right? It's like it's a pound of flesh. It's like you commit an eye for an eye. You commit a crime and you should be punished for it. And that seems, mean, evil even, to a lot of people. But this is what Durkheim wrote about. In order to have norms, you have to have punishment, because if you have a social norm, we all agree to this code. We're not going to murder anybody, right? That's wrong to do, and we're all going to agree not to murder anybody. Well, when somebody goes out and murders somebody, they have committed a crime not just against the victim. This is why we have a civil court system and a criminal court system. When you do a civil offense, you're just doing an offense against a private party. But when it's a criminal offense, you are committing a crime against your immediate victim, but also you have transgressed against the entire society. We have the state of California versus X, or the United States of America versus X, instead of private party versus private party.
I see. Yeah. So this is why, if you and I enter into a contract with each other, a business agreement or something, it'd sort of be me versus you. If one of us, if I claim that you violated the terms or something, but if I come to your house and maim you, it's not you versus me. You can't even, right? You could forgive me, let's say, if I come and maim you. But actually that doesn't mean that I wouldn't be prosecuted. The legal ball would still roll down, because I have, from a legal societal perspective, I've sort of, I have made a transgression against the wider society in addition to you as an individual.
Exactly. I'm not the only one you need to make amends to. So if I forgave you for maiming me, I could go to the prosecutor and express my forgiveness and plead for them not to prosecute you or to give you a lighter charge. And the prosecutor would probably take that into consideration, but it's their prerogative, not mine, to decide what to do with you. And, there's a social function to that process, which is that people, in order for the norm to be upheld, people need to know that if you break from that norm, then then society has essentially repaired the strength of the norm by having its retribution bear out. This is sort of like it's the same. Irving Goffman wrote about the apology, the act of apologizing to somebody, and how weird it is when you think about it. Because if I punch you in the face, and then I go, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And I'd say something to the extent of I don't know what came over me. That wasn't me. That was this other person, but of course it was me. And we all know it was me who did it. But what I'm saying is, in that moment that I transgressed against you, I was acting as somebody who doesn't have respect for this norm, not to punch you in the face.
And but in fact, I'm realizing that. Right. Now. Yeah.
You're paying tribute to the norm by saying, I'm sorry. I am somebody who acknowledges that norm. Will you please allow me back into the moral community by accepting my apology? And by doing that, you pay. It's like, what's the phrase for hypocrisy? Is the tribute that some people pay to, I'm forgetting the phrase, but anyway, it's like you apologize and you are essentially paying tribute to the norm by acknowledging that you transgressed against it, and by doing so, you acknowledge the continued validity to the norm, whose validity you have undermined by carrying out the transgression. That's what retribution serves in the criminal justice system. It upholds the norm. We all understand this because we're all, even including lefties who would like to take retribution out of the criminal justice system. We're all pissed off that no bankers went to jail after causing the financial crisis. Right. It's not enough that Merrill Lynch,
and it's not merely that some individual didn't go. It's that no broader signal was sent out to the wider community that if you engage in this behavior, you will be punished.
Exactly. And it's like we even though, we saved the economy from complete, Great Depression collapse, you could even say that there was some kind of restorative justice done with the banks with the passage of Dodd-Frank or whatever, or whatever the legislation was that put in the new rules. We've done the reparative work. One could make the case that we've done the reparative work to solve the problem. But the fact that no bankers went to jail indicates that we've done no work around the moral transgressions of Wall Street at that time. The lefties I argue with, I think would have no problem understanding that injustice. And yet there's this refusal to acknowledge that if you deal drugs on the street, if you're dealing fentanyl on the street for a year, and it's not enough that you just be, I mean, the most important thing is that that activity is stopped so that people's lives are saved. But also on top of that, you should be serving a punishment for that crime so that we uphold the norm that that's not okay to do.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of gets to, one of the things I thought was interesting that Durkheim wrote about was, why things become crimes. And I think what he was saying is that, the things that are crimes, it's not like we have a bunch of experts who sit down and sort of formulate all of these things scientifically or something. We actually make things illegal because they violate the things that are just already the intuitions of most people in a community. So literally what he said was, we do not condemn acts because they are crimes because we condemn them.
Right.
But then when you see people not condemning things that intuitively most people think are condemnable, that has this sort of acidic dissolving effect on, the sense of community that everyone feels wherever they live.
Yeah, this is one thing I love about Durkheim is that, when I started reading Durkheim, I, like many other people who come from a political tradition of the left, saw things, and still do. I'm still quite obsessed with class analysis, but it was a kind of a welcome respite to see it from another point of view, because Durkheim is very much not he doesn't look at the world through a class lens, and that's very helpful in achieving certain insights, which you would not get from a class analysis where you'd be like, well, the rules must be written that way because the ruling class favors it, when in fact you're like, no, you look at the genealogy of these rules, and that's not how they emerged at all. They emerged organically as a way to achieve social solidarity, to keep social, to keep communities coherent. And what we're seeing with this lawlessness in the Bay Area and the entire West Coast, really, I fear the consequences of it, because not only because of the material cost of crime, but also because of the undermining of any sense of, like, I'll give you a specific example. Retailers now in the mid-market area in San Francisco, right across the street from the Tenderloin, are now putting in place new rules because people are just shamelessly shoplifting, and you can't stop them, right? People are coming all day, every day, and just boosting product. And so, these practical measures are being put in place, like, okay, now for these products, you have to go to the register and ask for them. You can't just pull them off the shelves. And also, if you want to use the bathroom, you have to have an app that opens up the bathroom, because we have too many people coming in here and doing needles and dropping the needles down the toilet, clogging up the plumbing system. So it's like there's this sort of, like, these measures start to, like, in 5 years we're going to live in a world where, like, I feel like to go to Target you'll need to have an app that, like, has facial recognition or something, that, like, allows you into the store. And it's like, of course that's going to happen, because they need to put it, because if there's no law and order, then they need to create private access rules. And is that the society we want to live in, this bunker society where we're all just separated from each other? That should be a dystopia for people on the left, but that's the natural sort of conclusion for just not enforcing laws.
One of the things that I want to circle back to is, when we were talking about this sort of nonprofit industrial complex and how it evolves organically, and you get this sort of complementarity between the specific policies and actions that people in those institutions are advocating for, which serve the interests of the institution to perpetuate itself. There's this complementarity between that and the ideologies that evolved for people to rationalize what they're doing and why. And it seems like people often adhere to these ideologies with what I think can only be described as like a religious fervor. And, Durkheim and others wrote also a lot about, the purpose and function of religion in society. It's a topic I'm very interested in. So do you have any thoughts on, like, what the relationship between the decline of what we can just call traditional organized religions in America has been in relationship to the emergence and ascension of some of these new political and social ideologies, or these new sort of institutional structures that, are ostensibly trying to remedy problems that they are in fact perpetuating?
Yeah. So Durkheim wrote pardon this like mini lecture, but for I assume most of the listeners have not read Durkheim, but in the elementary forms of a religious life, Durkheim looked at the field notes of a bunch of anthropologists who were looking primarily at Aboriginal tribes in Australia, and he sort of in these were quote unquote primitive societies. I'm just going to use that term, even though some people find it offensive. But by primitive, and he used that term, but really, I think he even used the term savage. But really, what he meant was elementary, pre-division of labor, and so these were society communities in which people lived isolated lives. Like if you're a subsistence farmer, you live in a community where you have neighbors who you don't see every day because they live too far away, but you also don't see them every day because you don't need to see them every day because you're a subsistence farmer. Everything that you have is at home, right? With your family, you literally have no material need to see other people ever. So his question was, how do you cohere a community together of people who live materially isolated lives, or how do they cohere their communities together? So he looked at these tribes where that was essentially the material conditions of their existence. And he found that periodically they would come together and have these religious ceremonies in which that were really intense. They involved like a lot of dancing and drumming and spiritual elevation, chanting, and like going without
shamanism, basically.
Yes, yeah. Going out with water and food, without water and food for days on end, in intense heat, and so they would achieve this sort of transcendental experience with these rituals, and what Durkheim's theory was that, so he called this collective effervescence. It's like the feeling when you're in the midst of, like, we've experienced it on a sort of lower level, like a basketball game, or like a political march where you're like chanting and you just feel like you're one of the crowd and you're kind of uplifted, and it creates the sense of cohesion of everybody there. So basically you transcend your life as an individual and you enter into the sublime state when you belong to the life of the collective.
Yeah. And, immediately I think of a couple things here. Like, when you see, there are many kinds of examples of this, but, like when some sports team wins the championship and then everyone's out rioting in the streets, you're like, why the hell are they rioting effectively? But it's because they go into this psychological state where they don't feel like an atomized individual. They feel like part of a coherent community. And it is a very good feeling. People like having that feeling. And, I didn't actually expect the conversation to go here, but the last episode with a man named Michael Winkelmann, an anthropologist, was all about shamanism in ancient hunter-gatherer groups and, what it was and what it did. And the thing that I did not realize is how frequently these sort of shamanic group ritual practices involving, drumming and reaching these ecstatic states actually were. It wasn't once per year. It wasn't once per lunar cycle. It was every, 2 to 4 weeks in most traditional cultures, because presumably that frequency is required to maintain the kind of group coherence necessary to just have a stable society.
Durkheim actually writes about that. He says explicitly that, when these people go back to their own private existences as individuals, the collective effervescence that they experience has sort of like there's a residue of it that remains, but then it starts to deplete. And so like when it gets to the point where it's pretty much depleted, then there's a need for another cycle to bring the tribe together again. And in Durkheim's view, this is all in these pre-division of labor societies. He called this mechanical solidarity, because it was like a mechanical thing where you just like come together, have it, and then part, and then come together and apart. And it's very mechanical as opposed to organic. Organic solidarity is the solidarity that comes from from a more complex society. When I wake up in the morning and have a cup of coffee, right, it's like I'm waking up in a house that was built by somebody else, in a bed that was built by somebody else, with sheets that were manufactured by somebody else. I go and take out coffee beans that were grown by somebody else and distributed by somebody else. It's like a million people have participated in the process of getting me from the bed to my hot cup of coffee every morning, right? Because we're all integrated in that way. We are the farthest thing from self-sufficient. And so Durkheim believed, and I think was too confident in this opinion, that that organic solidarity, those material bonds of between us, start to sort of crowd out the need for this mechanical solidarity. And so that's why you have religion start to play more and more of a background role in modern societies. But the thing that we found is that you still need it's not enough. You still need the mechanical solidarity.
Yeah,
That's
that
why
collective effervescence must be
Mhm.
felt. Otherwise, things are just going to disintegrate into chaos.
Right.
So
And
something will evolve.
right. And so we had uh, uh, for a long time, the United States bucked the trend of Western Europe and continued to be a very religious society, even though, even in the United States, it tailed off over generations. But, we, as the most advanced capitalist society, we still had a lot of religion. And now we have been falling into the pattern of Western Europe with people being less and less attentive to church. And so now we found, other ways, and I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg in this case, but we found other ways to achieve this sort of in-group feeling. And a lot of that is, just like collective effervescence can be a very beautiful thing, and it can also be a very dangerous thing. And in the same way, the sort of in-group, out-group stuff that we're now finding, I think, online, it's like there's this digital version of collective effervescence, which is like, the group pylons on Twitter, the sort of the mob actions that create the sense of like, clearly the purpose is to, we don't quite achieve a transcendental state, but there is this feeling of belonging, this like kind of the very like lizard brain feeling of belonging that comes from interactions.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we all know intuitively that everyone wants to belong. When you start to think about it more deeply, right, we start to think about things like, we're social primates. We exist in social status hierarchies. People want to maintain their status or increase it. No one ever wants to decrease it. Mm-hmm. And that ties into some of the things that we're talking about, I think. And if I try and stitch a couple of things together here, when we were talking about the sort of nonprofit industrial complex and the sense of belonging it presumably gives the people that go into that line of work and subscribe to some of those ideologies, where do those people come from in the sense of, I think this probably ties into the fact that, right, college became so important for people to go to, and more people had to go to college, and we produced so many of those people. And I think a lot of people would even say that we overproduced to them, meaning more people started getting college degrees they thought were a ticket to, some higher level of social status, whatever exactly that meant for any individual. But there just weren't enough slots for a lot of people in other domains of life. And so that sort of overproduction of people that feel like they have this ticket to a higher level of social status creates a kind of anxiety that then funnels them elsewhere. Where does your mind go when we start thinking about things like that?
Yeah, the overproduction of elites has always been a very dangerous thing. So there I'm not an expert on this, but I have read accounts of the Crusades having been caused by the overproduction of elites, because as populations got denser in Europe, they had these primogeniture laws where you had to, hand all your land down to the first son, and what that means is that the land plots started getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and then the second son and the third son were left with nothing, and so you had all these elite warrior aristocrat nobles with nothing to do, and it became a crisis in Europe. And then they were like, okay, we've got to do something with these people, send them to Jerusalem, to reclaim the Holy Land. And then they went out and created this abomination of the Crusades. So it's like, this has always been a dangerous force in every society, and I think I do believe that we have that now, because we are producing more and more would-be white-collar workers. But the economy has become more and more bifurcated. There are only so many tech jobs to go around. And so we have, I think the experience of the millennial generation was one in which you had a bunch of kids who played by all the rules, went to good colleges. And I'm not talking about the majority of millennials. The majority of millennials, like every other generation, don't have college degrees. But among the elite tier of the millennials, you had all these kids going to college, and they, naturally expected to have a upper middle class lifestyle after graduating from a prestigious university. And, then they graduated in the time of the Great Recession, and there were no jobs for them. The sort of the girls, the HBO girls kind of story. And so first of all, I wrote about this once before, because Pierre Bourdieu wrote about this very similar moment when this happened in Paris in the 19th century that created the Bohemians. I won't go into that too much, but there's a parallel thing that happened now where there's this sort of like, because colleges have become so hyper politicized, these kids graduated from a school with this sort of training, with this sort of they had inculcated all these values of the political activist, and then they came out into a world in which their material expectations were not met. And so they started going into the industries that they could and competing with each other over these jobs in like tech and in media. But they brought with them this sort of the habitus of the professional, of the like the political activist. And so there became this contest within these industries that over like who's more politically pure. And you had this, you had like the New York Times, the pivot that the New York Times had towards wokeness was driven. There was a really interesting New York Magazine article about how it was driven by the tech workers, like the people who are designing the New York Times app, not the reporters. And it's because they'd all come from the New York Times had in its sort of mission to surpass which it achieved of surpassing all the other media outlets in terms of its digital presence, recruited all these people from Facebook and Twitter and all these Silicon Valley firms, recruited all these coders, but they couldn't compete salary-wise with those companies. So they basically said, look, well, you're wasting your life. Like, that you're not doing any good for the world by working for Facebook. If you come with us, like, we'll pay you a decent salary, but you'll get the psychic benefit of being able to make a difference in the world. And they bought that hook, line, and sinker. And then they came to the New York Times and they realized that journalism isn't like that they were like, you actually had to report stories as they happened and not the way you wish they'd happened, that people with opinions that you don't agree with get space on the op-ed page too. And they threw a fit and a temper tantrum. And this was kind of the what generated the anger around that Tom Cotton op-ed that ousted James Bennett as the opinion editor. A lot of that came from like the tech folks at the New York Times. So it's clearly something that's beyond just the media. It's a generational transformation that's occurred.
Yeah. And, one thing I want to unpack a little bit more is this concept of elites and what makes someone elite. And there's a lot of confusion there, naturally, because, this is a relative term. It's also a term that people use in different ways. When some people refer to the elites, they're talking about one group of people. When someone else refers to the elites, they're talking about other people. And I'm just wondering what your take is on what makes someone an elite. And I think maybe a good hook there is this distinction that I think you made in at least one of your articles between like financial, cultural, and moral capital. Right. And there's these different forms of like social capital we can have. Traditionally, we think of capital as being the financial version, and that's maybe the most intuitive to think about, but it's not the only version of social capital that someone can wield. And so can you contrast those things and maybe use that as a way to think about what actually makes someone elite or powerful in a society?
Yeah, so this is all Pierre Bourdieu, not my original thinking. So I'm just kind of regurgitating his theory. But he looked at it as there's economic capital, which was sort of the if you come from a Marxist tradition, you tend to see that as the sole distinguishing feature between classes, is your control of economic capital. Bourdieu perceived, because he came from an anthropological background and he came into sociology with an anthropological background, he kind of perceived that these market economies are at work in other things too. He started, and I don't want to go too far on a tangent, but he gained this insight because he went and did some research in Algeria, in French Algeria. And in Algeria at the time, the French were trying to impose upon Algerians their market-based way of thinking about the world, and it wasn't taking. And so all these academics were like, oh, these Algerians are acting in an economically irrational way. Their culture is just backwards because they can't accept Western economic rationality. And then he took a closer look and he was like, no, all of this stuff is very rational. It's like there's this gift-giving kind of practice, which Marcel Mauss and other people have also looked into, where it's like, but we understand this too. If you give somebody a gift and then they go, thank you, and then you give a gift right back to you, it's offensive, right? Because then it makes it look like an economic transaction. You have to wait a period of time. But then if you don't give anything back, then you also feel slighted, right?
Right.
There's this imperative that you need to wait a period of time to return the gift so that it doesn't look like a transaction, but it is in fact a transaction. And so it's sort of like, if you didn't understand that dynamic, then you'd look at somebody, you'd look at these exchanges and you would consider them economically irrational because a direct exchange wasn't made. But in fact, a direct exchange couldn't have been made because it would violate this cultural norm. You needed to have this person would need to wait a period of time before returning the favor. So it's sort of like there's all these other things at work that are not just like what we understand as like a money transaction.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's interesting. I actually just got back from Burning Man myself, which is by design a gift-giving culture. And just to riff on what you just said, yeah, you're meant to gift things to people with no expectation of anything in return. And so you shouldn't give someone a gift right after they give you one. But you also should be, you're looked at as, you should be the kind, if you're here, you should be the kind of person that is going to be giving gifts to people unconditionally. So if you're receiving gifts and you're never giving them out to other people, that transgresses that norm. And there's this sort of deep belief in people who participate in that event, for lack of a better term, that you ought to be the kind of person that gives gifts in that kind of way.
I feel like there should be like a sociological study or an anthropological study where you just send a bunch of people undercover into Burning Man who just violate the norm, who just like take and don't give back and just see what happens with the social structure of Burning Man.
Yeah, that's an interesting hypothetical. I'm definitely not going to advocate anyone actually do that. Yeah. It'll ruin the vibe.
So anyway, so Bourdieu looked at the, these other forms of capital, most famously cultural capital. And cultural capital is essentially the accumulated knowledge that one gains that allows them to function sort of fluidly and fluently within a given social circle. So, if you have, if you're going to be in upper middle class, a college educated America, then it helps to have some sort of basic understanding of, I don't know, fine arts, or like I should say, if you do have an extensive knowledge of, I don't know, like I'm trying to think of something that's more relevant than it would have been like 20 years ago, but like, I don't know, like in indie rock or something like that. Mm-hmm. That's going to get you somewhere, right? In a social circle of people who all graduated from 4-year universities and are living in a city. Whereas if you go into a blue collar background, it's going to get you absolutely nowhere, right? That's not the cultural capital that works within this other social circle. They have their own forms of cultural capital, which also don't translate into your elite circles. But Bourdieu saw the university as essentially a transmission vehicle of cultural capital to children of privilege, basically. I mean, there's various tiers of universities. So there were working class universities where you have different types of social cultural capital transmitted, but at the elite tier, you have people who are trained. Yes, you get some like actual job skills that help you on the job market, but most of what you're learning in a 4-year university, you're never going to use on the job. You're going to use it to in your social context, right?
And perhaps this ties into why, from that perspective, from like this sort of cultural, informational perspective, the prestigious universities in America, which I went through, they're very homogenous in that way. So like for example, like if you go to Harvard, I spent 5 years at Harvard, someone else could spend 5 years at Stanford. They're not going to be like completely distinct cultural experiences. No, they're actually going to be almost identical, even though like in theory, right, these are completely independent organizations. And yet like no matter what top tier university you go to, you get the same kind of general cultural vibes in each one. Basically.
Right. You get a basic sort of, they're finishing schools, right? You're taught a certain etiquette. Like finishing schools are easy to make fun of because you're like literally learning like which utensil to use. And that's like just so transparently about class, signaling. But a university education is essentially inculcates in you not only knowledge, like the actual body of knowledge that you absorb is probably the least important thing. It's much more a set of mannerisms, speech, the way that you carry yourself, the like an ironic sense of humor, like all these kind of like keys.
Yeah, it reminds me of right. So there's this contrast between, I think what you're saying is like, right, there's the things I learned when I was at university, like the declarative knowledge I literally learned in chemistry class.
Right.
That's, arguably secondary to, we'll just call the cultural beliefs that you pick up. And this reminds me of Rob Henderson's phrase. I talked to him some months ago on the podcast, and he came up with this term called luxury beliefs.
Yeah.
And it ties into what we're talking about. It's like you learn how to, it's right by direct analogy with the idea of a luxury good, right? A Louis Vuitton bag is a physical signal of your social status, your economic means. The idea of a luxury belief is you learn how to carry yourself and, say things a certain way or believe certain ideas as a way to signal, I'm part of this strata of the culture.
Right. What he calls luxury beliefs is what I call moral capital, which is just a subvariant of cultural capital. Because in the past, when Bourdieu wrote, he's been dead 20 years. He wrote primarily in the last century, but, and in France. But when he would write about the sort of the cultural capital of, familiarity with classical music and with the canonical poetry and stuff like that, that doesn't get you far in America. If you're if you're like start talking about Proust or something, people are just going to think you're an insufferable snob. It's not going to get you any status. Maybe in some places would still get you status, but you're much better off with a sort of a set of political and moral beliefs so there's been this kind of transition where we've stopped using this knowledge of high culture, and we've started to use as a class signifier a sensitivity and a subscription to certain political beliefs and values, and like this very refined sensitivity around how you use the language. Like it's not a coincidence that you now there's actually a learning curve. Like it's not enough just like you grew up working class and then you have liberal politics because that's where your material interests are aligned. In fact, a lot of those people are shunned by sort of the most elite tiers as being, brutes, right? Because maybe they may have even considered voting for Trump because Trump was, railing against the elites, and so they're like monstrous. Whereas, if you have a command of the sort of the lexicon around, centering Black bodies and like these kind of obscure, really bizarre ways of speaking, that indicates your class belonging and your upper middle class pedigree. And so there's been this sort of shift from the cultural capital that Bourdieu wrote about to now in an American context and increasingly in just a Western context it's the exact same thing, but it's just the subvariant of what I call moral capital and what Rob calls luxury beliefs as these class signifiers. And
so how does this start to tie into, we were talking about religion earlier. How do elites sort of wield religious or ideological concepts in order to secure and protect their status as elites? And that could mean, right, that could mean elite in any sense of the word. It could mean someone with a lot of economic capital. It could mean someone with a lot of cultural capital. But how do we start to think about how some of these like ideologies evolve such that the concepts they're deploying are serving to sort of secure and protect people that have acquired a certain amount of status in society?
Well, it's just like I just wrote a piece that I published the other day about the historical origins of cultural capital, looking at Norbert Elias's book, Civilizing Process. I might be mispronouncing his name because I've always called him Norbert Elias, but then I've watched some YouTube videos where people were calling him Elias. So I don't know which one is right. But anyway, I'll stick with Elias. Norbert Elias's book is about the transition from feudalism to this sort of the period of transition from feudalism, capitalism, and the development of manners. And there's a point in time in the royal courts where the aristocrats were in competition with the rising bourgeoisie, and they had already come to a point of fetishizing manners as a way of signifying your class distinction. And as the bourgeoisie learned those manners, like it's not too hard to figure out which utensils to use and what intonation to give certain languages, like they could adopt those skills too. And as they did, the aristocrats had to further and further refine their manners and to a point of absurdity, where it became like a Japanese tea ceremony, but that was born out of the competition of having to, like, every time the bourgeoisie would learn would learn the appropriate mannerisms and the appropriate etiquette, then the aristocrats would refine it even more so that they could call the bourgeoisie so they could continue to call the bourgeoisies like vulgar pretenders. And I think a similar thing happens with these political beliefs. It's like, now it's not enough that you're just like not overtly racist or not racist at all, and you subscribe to affirmative action and you have, like, all these other kind of conventionally liberal beliefs. You have, well, you're still a racist because you're not deploying this particular language, because you don't have this even more radical belief of reparations and whatever. And, like, and then once reparations becomes commonly accepted, then it's like, well, that's, there will be another tier because it is no longer useful as a status conferring class distinction mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, it really does get sort of down to basic human chimp stuff. Like, everyone wants to be cool, right?
Right.
The way you're cool, by definition, not everyone can be equally cool. So,
right.
Like, you have to be cooler than other people. It's almost like, if I try and think back to like high school or something, like, you start to listen to some like obscure indie band or whatever because it's cool and it distinguishes you from the people who haven't even heard of that band yet. But then, like, everyone starts listening to them and, well, that's not cool anymore. Now you have to find like the new band that no one else has heard of. It's basically the same thing happening.
Yeah, well, I'm Gen X, so I know that very well. That, like, maybe that's why I'm so drawn to the notion of cultural capital, because of course in my generation it was like, when we were kids, we were famous for that, right? Like, you found this cool edgy thing and you're like, ugh, and then like people were forever talking about selling out. They sold out. You sold out. They sold out. Da, 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 because it was like, once Green Day, right? They were like, everybody loved Green Day and they were like playing at the Gilman and they were punk rock, and then all of a sudden they got a big record deal. I mean, they literally like totally sold out in a huge way. They admit it, but it's like, once they got popular, then it's like the worst thing in the world was to listen to Green Day. So it's like, it was that it was all about status competition. It was like, well, I'm refined, I'm so edgy that I'm on top of the newest thing, and once everybody starts listening to it, it's not cool anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm so confused, and why people my age are so confused by like these like influencers now, where it's completely the opposite. It's like they're like so eager to be sponsored by brands and to be listened to millions of people, and we're like, wait, but that's not cool. I don't get it. It doesn't compute.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'm interested in here is, we've been talking about this notion of cultural capital and social status, and sort of some of the psychological and sociological concepts surrounding how some of these ideologies evolve, and why people want to wield and use certain ideas to achieve a certain level of social status. With all of that in mind, my background is in like hardcore basic research science. Mm-hmm. So I sort of come from that tradition. And what's sort of really interesting, and what a lot of people go through as they go into graduate school and do their PhD and then their postdoc, and then like they get higher and higher up the scientific ladder, is there's this sort of there's this sort of distinction to be made between like the idealized version of the process of science, and science is sort of this special thing that is unpolluted by all the other like political and social things that most people go into science to avoid. Right. And then you sort of come up against the harsh reality of the mechanics of science, like how do I actually socially and administratively do the things that allow me to get grants and be within the structure that will allow me to do the literal science that I actually want to do. And so given all the things that we were just talking about, how people wield certain ideas and how certain ideologies evolve to for people to justify like how they're going to ascend or protect their social status, how do secular enterprises, including things like science, start to get co-opted by elite factions to serve political and social ends? Yeah,
I mean, first of all, we saw that so vividly during COVID, right? With the scientists virtue signaling, just like every other idiot on Twitter. But like, I feel like this what you're describing as the scientific enterprise very much harkens back to what we were talking about the nonprofit industrial complex, where like Martin Gurry writes about this exact thing in The Revolt of the Public, which is like, we continue to have this conception of scientists in the way that we conceived of them in like the turn of the century, of the turn of the 20th century, the heroic sort of renegade scientist who works alone, Albert Einstein, right, in their lab, pursuing the truth and discarding all the conventions. And that's not how science works anymore, as you know better than I. Now it is a big bureaucratic process in which, if you're a successful scientist, first of all, you're always working on a team. Second of all, like if the most successful scientists are running their own labs, right? They get to a point within as bureaucrats where they have steady funding. They have a payroll that they're meeting. They're small business people, basically. They're running their lab. They have their research assistants who are paid. And in order to do that, you need to keep getting your NIH grants, right? Like every year, you have to, like, that is foremost at your mind, is renewing is continuing that grant cycle. And so you fall into a pattern of doing the same experiments over and over and over again every fucking year, right? Like you're just tweaking this thing and you're tweaking that thing. You know that they're going to approve it and give you funding the next time if you're just like, well, we've done these 12 variations, but there's these other 4 variables that we now have to tweak. So we're going to do that next year. So give us more money. So it's like you can be a very like genuine scientist with a lot of intellectual integrity and moral integrity and still fall into the pattern of just being on the hamster wheel. Very much in the way that you can go into helping the homeless and have all your moral integrity, but you fall into the hamster wheel of just being like needing to continue that funding and keep the machine going. And so then you adopt the most convenient ideology that justifies that. I'm not sure what the equivalent of that ideology would be among hard scientists. You might know that.
Well, I'm sort of interested in this phenomenon of, follow the science.
Right.
That phrase and variations of it that are being repeated so often now, because on the one hand, of course, someone like me, someone with a scientific background, totally believes in following science.
Right.
But on the other hand, we both know that follow the science as a social phenomenon, that's not really what it is. It right. more or less basically means blindly follow someone with a certain type of credential just because they have it.
Right.
Or you must believe this thing and it must be true because one peer-reviewed paper in Nature magazine says it could be true.
Right.
And, ironically, it's a very unscientific way to think, where you're sort of just meant to have
a religious way to think.
It's a religious way to think. You're meant to have faith in
have faith in the science.
A faith in the science, ironically, in what you can describe as the modern day clergy. So what do you make of this phenomenon, and where do you think it's going? Or what do you think it's doing, like sociologically?
Yeah, well, I think that there is I don't have an answer to that question, but it is a question that I have that I think about, that I try to think about quite a bit, which is this sort of the rise of the professional managerial class and what it's doing to democracy. Because in my mind, democracy is this very messy process. I believe in democracy. I think it's the highly imperfect system, which is the best one that we'll ever have. But democracy, the sort of the media crowd that's constantly invoking the death of democracy at the hands of the Trumpists, in many ways are the most undemocratic people there are, because they're constantly trying to block this faction, which I don't know, I'm no fan of Trump. I don't agree with those voters, but they have a right to have their point of view in a democratic society. And so I do think that there's this sort of there's this new ruling class that has emerged. It's no longer a capitalist class. The capitalists are part of it, but it's this managerial class. And democracy is not the most useful sort of form of government for that ruling class. Ironically, you can say that democracy was the most useful for the capitalist class at the time that capitalists were undisputedly running things. And that's not to say that capitalists were like some enlightened bunch of good-hearted people who wanted to give everybody a voice, but in a society with a complex division of labor, everybody had some, this is very Durkheimian, everybody has some power, even if you're just making widgets, right? Because the economy can't work without your labor power combined with everybody else's. And so the system has to grant you some political autonomy. The system, you are able to make demands on the system in a way that a serf was not able to, because you can do things like organize unions and go on strike. So a democracy was a way in which you could contain, which you could essentially like sort of appease every part of the economy that was necessary for the economy to function. So that's still the case, but we have a more bifurcated economy than we used to, and it's very top heavy with this managerial class. So I feel like things are, this might sound half baked because it is. I haven't thought all this stuff through, but I do believe that there is a sort of a drift towards technocracy that we're experiencing right now, which is a much more conducive form of public administration for the professional managerial class than democracy is.
And let's just unpack a couple terms here to make it crystal clear for people who haven't been exposed to them before. You talked about technocracy, and you keep talking about this professional managerial class. So what exactly are those two things?
So the professional managerial class, I think the best way to describe it is the way that James Burnham, who wrote about this class, and he wrote about it he called it just the managerial class, but he wrote a book in 1941, making a lot of predictions which did not come to pass, but which now seem more relevant than they've been since the time that he wrote the book. So there's like back in the 19th century, you had the owning class, you had the capitalists, and you had the proletariat, right? Then from a sort of Marxist point of view, which I subscribe to. I think that Marx had the right analysis for 19th century capitalism. You had one set of class interests that the workers had and one set of class interests that the owners had, and those were irreconcilably opposed to one another, and you had class struggle emerge from that. But we live in a different capitalism now. Over the course of the 20th century, with Fordism and with the expansion of the federal government and with a whole bunch of changes that came along with the advancement of technology, you had this massive new class, which was neither worker nor owner, right? They didn't own the means of production. They didn't own the companies outright. They didn't own their offices, the buildings, their desks, their equipment. In that sense, they were like workers, right? When you come to work, you don't own the equipment that you use. The owner owns the equipment. You're just using it. The same way you come to work as a white collar worker, and you don't own the office, you don't own the desk and the computer. But so in that way, you're like a worker, but you're not like a worker, right? Because you do control the means of production, even if you don't own them, right? Mm-hmm. Without the technicians, without these people with a very high degree of expertise, and that's everybody from like scientific expertise to managers, like people managers.
Yeah.
People who know how to manage a bureaucracy.
Yeah. I guess, it even goes back to your example of like the software engineers at the New York Times making the app.
Right.
They don't own the New York Times like a capitalist owned, a factory in 1850, but they literally control like how the thing works, and they have a disproportionate say in like how it's going to function. Right.
And unlike the proletarians, like when you have these simple machines, if they go on strike, they have to do a sit down strike really to be able to prevent you from replacing them, because they go on strike, you hire replacement workers because anybody can do your job, right? In the 19th century with these factories, anybody could do that job. Whereas with these guys, not anybody can run the New York Times app. Very few people can run the New York Times app. And also very few people can run a bureaucracy of like 500 people. That takes a lot of skill to have the management skills to be able to know how to organize workflow and all these things that it's easy to make fun of as being superfluous jobs, but they're actually highly technical, highly specific like jobs that these companies would not be able to operate without those people doing those jobs. So you have this big tier, and this also includes government workers, and it includes the creative class people, and it includes academics. There's all these people who just do not fit into workers versus owners, who don't own the means of production, but they do control the means of production. As a matter of fact, control them more than those who we used to call the capitalists. Because like now, like who owns a publicly traded company, right? Like 10,000 individual stockholders, a bunch of sovereign wealth funds, some pension funds or whatever. These aren't like it's not like it used to be with a guy in a top hat and a monocle who owns the company. It's divided up into all these different institutions, and those institutions themselves are run by PMCs, right? Like if you go to a hedge fund or you go to a pension fund, most of the people who are staffing it belong to the professional managerial class. So who really controls the means of production in the United States? Who really even owns the means of production in the United States? The professional managerial class, which is sort of a fusion between what Marx viewed as the capitalist class and this new set of professionals who Marx couldn't even ever imagined. So that's what I call together the professional managerial class. And it's like everybody who, if you graduated from a 4-year university and you're in one of these jobs like media or tech or something, it's pretty much everybody everybody you work with, certainly, probably a lot of people in your family, and probably most of your friends belong to that class. And that is, and that class is a distinct minority within America. Most people are working class. Most people didn't go to college.
Yeah, but it strikes me that it probably doesn't feel that way to people within the class. So nominally, at least, I'm a part of that class. Like I have a highly advanced degree. I have a lot of technical skills. I deploy them inside of a private company that's very technical in nature in terms of what we do. And everyone in my immediate life, my friends, my coworkers and stuff, it sort of feels like that's just what everyone does. But of course, the vast majority of Americans aren't in the bubble that I'm in.
There's a book that was recommended to me and that I read and enjoyed by a totally persona non grata author, who's Charles Murray, who co-wrote the Bell Curve. So, it takes some boldness for me to even admit I read the book, but I actually don't care. It's an excellent book. It's called Coming Apart, and it's about, he looks at white America. And the reason why he looks at white America specifically is because he wanted to basically control for the variable of race and look purely at class. So he didn't want to look at all of America, because then he does return to everybody else at the end. But he's like, okay, let's look at what's happening to people who cannot say that this is because of racial discrimination or, it's just white people. And he paints a very compelling portrait of a radically bifurcated America in which, he talks about these things that he calls super zips, which are these zip code corridors in which these are contiguous areas of contiguous zip codes, wherein basically 90% of the people of residents within those zip codes have 4-year college degrees. And then there's these vast oceans of zip codes where nobody does. And so if you live in one of these super zips, and more of America have become divided between super zips and non-super zips, if you live in one of these super zips, if you go to a Target, you're going to interact with a retail worker. But other than that, you will never, none of your neighbors, nobody at your church, if you still go to church, nobody at your kid's swim class, nobody in your geographical area is not like you. So yeah, if you live in that world, you're going to have the impression that this is what America is. And then when people start voting a different way, when people, who you've never interacted with, who your kids don't go to school with, start voting in a way that you think is sacrilegious, then it's like the barbarians at the gate, right? It's like we're surrounded by all these brutish monsters who are voting for Donald Trump. So that class divide it's a cultural divide, but it's like an existential cultural divide.
And in many ways, what we've been talking about, what a lot of people have been talking about recently, for a number of years now, is this general idea of decline, of civilizational decline. And, the way that I start to think about this is, we know that organisms are mortal, right? We grow, we stagnate, we age, we die. All organisms will decay. All companies will decay. I had a really interesting guest named Jeffrey West, who wrote a book called Scale, which is all about, comparing how organisms, cities, and companies grow and scale, and then
Oh, wow.
in cases decline. And basically what he says is, organisms, companies are like organisms, they're mortal. So their internal dynamics are such that, they can't live forever.
Right.
Cities, on the other hand, can. So just to take some trivial examples, like, Hiroshima is still here.
Right.
You can drop a nuclear bomb on a city and the city will come back. But of course, that's distinct from the culture or the civilization that is infusing the city. And he doesn't talk about that in his book, but it seems to me like, right, cultures and civilizations are more like organisms than cities themselves, right? They have a time course. Like, right, Rome eventually ended. Ancient Egypt isn't with us anymore. Like, cultures and societies bloom. They reach various crises points, and then they decline. So, are we right now in the West broadly, in the US specifically, are we in such a state of decline? And is that an inevitable thing that we just have to go through, or can we kind of reverse it?
I mean, I think we're in a decline. And I would also say that, America kind of cuts against his examples. And I'm sure he probably accounts for this in his theory, but like, we do see dying cities in America, right? Cities that were dependent upon industrial manufacturing, which are just like ghost towns now. But I think that we're in a period of decadence in the United States. I think that we're in a period in which, we have a highly sort of privileged ruling class, which is completely out of touch, maybe more than ever before, with most of the country, with the population in most of the country. Even the capitalists, the top-hatted, monocled capitalists of Marx's time were like, in their factories, presumably, like managing their workforces and interacting with the working class. Whereas, unless you live in a city like New York, if you belong to the PMC, there's a good chance that you're never having those interactions at all. So I think that we're living I think that's a very, very dangerous situation for a polity to be in, for a democratic society to be in. But I think the people in that ruling class are going to be fine, right? They're like, it's a very cosmopolitan class. It's the kind of people who can get up and move to London anytime, if things get bad enough here, they'll be fine. But the people in the rest of the country, not so fine. I don't want to predict where that'll be going. I am reading a book right now called by Peter Zeitlin called The End of the World is Just the Beginning, or something like that, which addresses exactly this question, but I'm not very far into it. I'm just a couple of chapters into it.
So what was so Durkheim had this concept of anomie, and it ties into some of the things that we touched on to do with, social order and having, moral coherence among a group. And, when certain things break down, the whole sort of, you enter into like a state of decline and degradation in a society. So what was this concept of anomie, and how does what we've been talking about sort of speak to that?
Right, so Durkheim wrote this essay called Suicide, which was his sort of earliest, most like sort of foundational work, because it set the stage for the argument that he was making, which is he made throughout his career, which is that society is an entity sui generis, which meaning that society is not just the sum total of individuals. Society has a reality which is separate and apart from our reality as individuals, and therefore it deserves its own field of study, which is sociology. So in Suicide, he looked at the incidence of suicide, I think it was in Paris, among Protestants versus Catholics, and found a distinct difference between, basically, Protestants were far more likely to kill themselves than Catholics, if I'm remembering correctly. He attributed it to Protestants are much more likely to worship alone, and it's much less centered upon the congregation. They were much more, they tended to be more isolated from one another. So from that, he kind of extrapolated this theory of like social anomie, where when you don't have what a lot of sociologists call social capital. Bourdieu wrote about social capital as well, but he wrote about it in a different way than like writers like Robert Putnam, who's very famous for writing about social capital, write about social capital. But sort of the conventional American way of looking at social capital is things like, baseball teams and bowling leagues and churches and the things that bring us together. So the social capital is something that's communally held. So like within a community that's high in social capital is a community that has a lot of institutions that bring people together. And we've been losing, and everybody understands, like everybody's looked at this, agrees that we've been losing social capital for the past 100 years. We live lives entirely separate from each other. There is one big sort of variable which needs to be accounted for, which is the internet, which has divided us and brought us together in different ways. So that complicates the picture, but people aren't joining voluntary societies anymore. And as we become more isolated from each other, there's a consequence to us collectively. There's a deterioration of the social fabric, and we experience it on a personal level. Like people get depressed, and a physical level, people start to develop medical conditions that they didn't used to have because of their reactions to emotional stress and things like that. Diabetes, stuff like that, and so that's all part of anime. I think there's a good case for taking a look at what's happening in the city of San Francisco, because certainly the chaos and lawlessness, which people are exposed to every day, at least see it every day, has psychological effects. For one thing, people probably spend a lot more time locked up in their homes, because it feels unsafe to go outside, participate less in public life. There's public spaces which people don't go to anymore because they've been taken over by tent encampments. So my expectation would be that if you could measure the social solidarity and the social capital from like 30 years ago to today in San Francisco, you probably see a pretty precipitous drop off, like more so than the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm. And are you, you're a parent? Is that accurate?
I'm a parent. Yeah. I have a 2-year-old.
With your perspective, being a parent, how do you think, things like parenting and fertility rates and demographic shifts play into this notion of civilizational decline or anomie? When you look at the fact that we have an aging population that needs to be supported in the ways that older people inevitably will need to be supported. When you think about I think quite strong drop in fertility rates that we're seeing in the US and elsewhere, how do you think that ties into the trajectory we're on as a society?
Yeah, well, it's funny because when I grew up, everybody was freaking out about overpopulation, which is like the social sort of conditions for that concern rising up could fill an entire other podcast, because a lot of it has to do, in my opinion, with misanthropy, and a lot of it gave rise to elements of the alt-right. But everybody's freaking out about overpopulation, and now, of course, we're in a reality in which most of the advanced capitalist world is well below replacement level in terms of fertility. Europe is below replacement level. Japan is way below replacement level, famous for it. And America has been below replacement level. And the main reason why it hasn't really impacted us in the way that it's impacting Europe is because of our immigration policies. I'm by the way, quite pro-immigration, even though I want to see all these Honduran drug dealers in San Francisco deported right away. Generally on immigration, I'm quite liberal. I think that immigration has saved the United States in a way that it hasn't with Europe, because we do have such a low fertility level. So I think that's going to catch up. You can't backstop it with immigration forever, and if you do attempt to, then there's all sorts of other, ancillary consequences that come along with it, not all of which are good. And so, yeah, I think it's a big problem. It's not one I have any sort of expertise in or anything particularly insightful to offer. But I think you look at Japan and you see 10 years into the future of the United States, and it's not good.
And so I don't think we mentioned up front, but you run a Substack. I read your articles fairly frequently. It's one of my favorite Substacks.
Thank you.
Can you point people to that, but also maybe just kind of summarize, what do you think? You write about a lot of different subjects, and there's a lot of richness there, but there does seem to be kind of overarching themes to what you're interested in, what you write about. So how would you summarize that for people?
Yeah. So my Substack is leightonwoodhouse.substack.com. And since my first name is difficult to spell, I'll just spell it, which is Leighton, Woodhouse is just how it sounds. But I don't. So the big themes that I write about in my Substack are, number one, I report quite a bit about crime and drugs, and so some of that makes it into my Substack. It's not every week, but it's a consistent theme. And then I write a lot about the professional managerial class, which we've described today. I write a lot about social theory. So I've read from Weber to Bourdieu to Durkheim, Marx, etc. I try to factor, or I guess I'm naturally inclined to factor a lot of that into my writing. But I'm not sure what brings those two threads together. I don't know if there is a thread to bring those two things together, but it has occurred to me that I tend to write about the elite, and then I tend to write about the least elite, which is like, what Marx called the lumpen proletariat, right? The drug users, people who are truly marginalized from society, homeless, street addicts, and I think that there's I don't know that I could describe persuasively what ties those two themes together, but I think that they both tell a story about America. I think that they both have dark implications for the future of this country. The fact that this population of homeless drug addicts is growing and growing and is subsuming more and more of our cities, and more people are falling into that category, middle class kids. Like it used to be that, it was people who lived lives of lots of trauma who would fall into addiction. But now the drugs have become so powerful that you can make one mistake, the kind of mistakes I used to make all the time as a teenager. You order Xanax on Snapchat just to fuck around, and you get fentanyl. And you end up hooked on fentanyl. Like, you can come from a very stable background with no trauma in your life and end up a homeless street addict. That's happening. So there's also that phenomenon. So you have that sort of reality in America growing, and then at the same time you have this like increasingly intolerant, in my opinion, like politically and socially and culturally intolerant ruling class emerging, which believes itself to be so virtuous that it thinks of itself as the saviors of democracy. But I think that there are cultural instincts among that class that pose severe hazards to democratic society. So those are some various kind of threads that I try to weave together.
What's something that makes you feel optimistic or potentially optimistic about the future? Is there anything going on culturally that gives you that sense of optimism?
I think I was much more cynical before I started to hang out and collaborate with Michael Schellenberger, who, is persona non grata among a certain faction of the left because he's been willing to buck a lot of orthodoxies. But the irony is that his vision for the world, which he backs up with his research, is far more optimistic than the conventional views on the left. Like, he wrote a book about climate change. His background is in environmental activism and specifically in energy policy, and is a big booster of nuclear energy. And he debunked a lot of the doom and gloom stories about climate change. I do think climate change is real, and I do think that climate change is a profound threat. It does concern me, but I also think that there's a messianic sort of vibe within the left, that there's some sort of like weird eroticism about the end of the world that people are like romantically attracted to, and a lot of that factors into climate change. There's the same kind of instinct that factored into the idea that we were going to overpopulate the planet, and that the planet was going to reach its carrying capacity by 1998 or something, and fall into oblivion. Of course, that didn't happen. When you look at the actual facts, some of these dystopian fairy tales start to fall apart at the seams when you look at like the promise of nuclear power, which has started to become destigmatized even on the left in recent months, really. When you look at like liquid natural gas and how it's not actually like how it is a practical bridging technology to cleaner energies, and it's far cleaner than fossil fuels. You start to see these stupid decisions being made around like Germany shutting down its nuclear power, and then now getting cut off from liquid natural gas from Russia. So now they're turning back to fossil fuels. So you start to see these boneheaded policies that make you more depressed about the future. But when you see the material possibilities of smarter decisions that could be made, that makes me a lot more optimistic. Like I think that the most dystopian threats that we face are not the ones that most people are looking at. I think that there are things like the cultural divides that we have, the like social enemy, countries becoming more isolated from one another. There's like all these sort of sociological indices which are going in the wrong direction. And I'm very concerned about those. I will throw in one thing that I think gets probably not enough play just because I read a book about it, but which you might know more than I do because this gets into the natural sciences. But after reading listening to an episode of Rogan, I read Shania Swan, I think is her name, her book about phthalates and about the microplastics and how they're basically making us all infertile. And it was pretty persuasive. And I was like, holy shit, if this is true, like never mind climate change, like we'll go extinct as a species within a couple generations.
I'm not a super expert in that area, but I feel reasonably confident in saying that what for lack of a better term, what modernity has done among other things is polluted our ingestive environment. We're literally consuming into our bodies knowingly and unknowingly through food and literally through our skin and other things, many things which are just mucking with us and our endocrinology and other aspects of our biology. And I think it is having very real consequences for people's physical health and their psychology.
Yeah, the anogenital distance, the taint, has been like getting smaller and smaller generation to generation. And by the way, it's not just humans; it's happening in all types of animals. And as that distance has gotten smaller, they've become less and less fertile. It's really scary stuff. But I'm skeptical about any sort of like claims to the end of civilization, I'm very open to arguments about the slow decline of civilization, and somehow more skeptical about these ideas of these sudden like cliffs that we're inevitably going to fall over, just because I think that there's so much glory in writing about that stuff, and there's so much of a weird emotional appeal to those kinds of visions that I'm like, okay, what's at work here? Is this real, or is this like fulfilling some weird psychic need?
Yeah. And one last thing I want to ask you about is just, as a writer, as a journalist, you've chosen the Substack route, as many people have, an increasing number over the last few years. Given the general environment of journalism, all the way from the New York Times and sort of the classic journalistic institutions to the independent writing that's happening on Substack, what made you go to Substack? How has that been going? And what do you see there in terms of how writing and writers and the dissemination of ideas and how that interfaces with tech? Where do you see that going?
Well, for myself, it's kind of funny. I'm kind of a loser, actually, when it comes to being a journalist, because, before I did my Substack, I've been freelancing for many years, and I applied for staff positions at many different publications, and like I wasn't even getting interviews, and I don't know why. Like, I consider myself a fairly decent reporter, just like on basic journalism, but my going to Substack was not like it was with, say, Glenn Greenwald, like a real triumphant move. It was more like, oh, I'll try this out because it's another source of income, and it's been very I've had modest success with Substack. I'm not one of the top Substackers, but it's been a significant part of my overall sort of income portfolio. So it's been that's more successful than I expected it to be. But I found since that happened, like I'm very, very glad that I never got those interviews, because I really enjoy writing independently. like now writing freelance isn't just, writing freelance isn't just, like a necessary, it's not just like my backup plan. It's like I actually really enjoy that much more than if I was taking assignments from editors, but also because of the freedom that I have to explore all these really nerdy topics that I'm able to explore on Substack has been very fulfilling to me. So it's those two things in combination with the fact that the direction that the media has gone, I would be enormously unhappy if I was on the staff of, say, the New York Times, or the staff of even like, The Intercept, who I used to write for quite a bit. It would be absolutely miserable. So yeah.
Like one of the things I love about reading you and other people on Substack is that there's really two things. One, because it's independent writing, it's an individual, not reporting to, one or more editors and things like that. You do get to explore these nerdy topics and sort of infuse stories with ideas and concepts that probably wouldn't get greenlighted at a traditional media outlet. And two, just that I know that it's an individual. So whether or not I agree with any particular thing that you say or that you're writing about, it's very clear that this is, it's a good piece of writing that's been edited and polished, but it's not going through the same filters that it would go through elsewhere. And you really do get the sense on Substack that you are hearing the sort of raw, polished, but still raw thoughts of an individual human being. Yeah,
there's been a lot of talk about how Substack has kind of opened up avenues for people with unorthodox political views, and that's true, and that's been a big value that Substack has added to the world. But also, just in terms of the nerdy stuff, like Razib Khan is a friend and one of my favorite Substacks, and he's able to write these like 10,000 word pieces about like the genetic origins of the Vikings and their like migration patterns into Russia in like the 3rd century AD or whatever. Well, actually, probably much earlier than that. And like these, like, and like he writes about that stuff all over the world. The migration from Korea to Japan and like among like, like primitive tribal hunter gathering peoples. And he like has an extremely successful Substack. There's a lot of people reading it, myself included. And it's like, that stuff used to be relegated to academia, and they were in inaccessible journals in very obscure academic language. And as it turns out, there's a big readership for some pretty nerdy stuff. And I think that is just intellectually a huge contribution that Substack has made to the world.
All right. Well, Leighton Woodhouse, thank you for your time. Why don't you just tell everyone where your Substack is once more, just in case they missed it?
Yeah, Leighton Woodhouse. So that's Leighton, LeightonWoodhouse.substack.com. And the Substack is called Social Studies.
All right. Well, that's it. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.